You. Ari, thank you for the warm introduction. Gila, good to see you, and thank you for making the connection. Also, just want to acknowledge Rabbi Shai Cherry, who is a colleague in Philadelphia who's on the call, and who wrote a great book a couple of years ago that I read when it was nominated for the National Jewish Book Award. I don't remember the title, but I'm sure if you go to Amazon, you can find Shai Cherry's book there. It's really like underlined the entire book, and at which point it was worthless to underline anymore. But anyway, it's great to be with you all. I want to say a couple words to frame this. Part of what I'm going to do today is to play a role of like provocateur and instigator. And, a lot of this comes from my work at Penn Hillel for all of those years. A lot of it comes from great mentors and thought partners who were part of that experience, people like Jeremy Brachen and Dan Liebenson and Adam Simon. But I understand that in real life, managing an organization, managing change is more complicated than I'm going to make it today. But one of the things that's nice about kind of coming in at 50,000 feet is just the ability to push. And I say this actually every time I do a version of this talk, which is I think there are three outcomes, all of which are equally positive from my perspective, which is very happy if this is exactly the way that you think already, and you have these ideas, and maybe the book and some of the images in the slide deck that I'm going to share will help you advance the work that we're all trying to do to build a new operating system for Jewish life. For some people, it might feel totally new and make new connections, in which case that's great, and I'm happy if it feels like a new idea. And I'm also happy for people to rub against the ideas. And I think about most of the trainings I've had in my life that have been really meaningful. It's when I disagree with the speaker, and in the process, I end up starting to draft my own vision for what I want to do in the future. So I think all three of those are good, but I think that a big part of my job is to make this simple, even though it's not, and to be a little bit provocative. So this should be fun and energetic, and everyone should feel a little bit uncomfortable at some point in the talk if I'm doing it right. So let's dive in. What I'm going to do also, just maybe all of you know this already, I'm going to kind of lay out the major ideas, and then Ari is going to do Q&A towards the end. So if you do have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat. You can message them directly to Ari, and he'll kind of moderate which of those kind of make it into the final Q&A. So let me dive in. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm happy to share the slide deck with everybody on the call also. I'll make sure that the link is available for folks. So there's obviously a question here about millennials. And the truth is, it's not just millennials. People who, I'm a Gen Xer, and I share some of these features. And now we're already into the age, certainly, of Gen Z. Those are like the young people on college campuses. I have Gen Zers at home. I even have Gen Alpha, who are the little kids who seem to have the weirdest lingo of any generation yet. But when it comes to the question of how people orient themselves to institutions, to organized religion, to denominations, even to like big macro organizations like the State of Israel, the way that individual Jews relate to that big institution as the State of Israel, the change really shows up with millennials. And then we can say something a little bit glibly, but honestly, which is that Gen Z is just like this, but a little bit more so. There are features that are different between Gen Z and millennials, but for the sake of argument, this really starts here with millennials. These are people more or less who were born around the year 1980, who came of age in the millennial. And these are already people now who are in their early 30s, but they're starting to assume positions of leadership and involvement in organized Jewish life. So it's still relevant in that way. There are four kind of major trends that I want to frame with. And if we had time, I would ask you, like, what are the things that are challenging organized Jewish life today? And I think one of the things that I'm going to try to make the case for is that the operating system or the delivery system for Jewish life is totally perpendicular from the trends of all the other features of North American life about how people access information, entertainment, how they organize their identity, how they relate to everything in their lives. And it's a thing that we're trying to sustain institutions, but the mission underneath these institutions is really a Jewish future, not just the sustenance of these institutions. So the top two kind of images represent one major change that's taken place over the last 40 or 50 years, which is there's been a huge shift from macro community to micro community. And macro just means big communities doing the same thing at the same time, synchronous communities, and a big shift from one size fits all to customization. An example of this is that when I Love Lucy was on television, 74% of Americans watched the same show at the same time with the exact same commercials. That is a great example of how in the 1950s, there was broad macro community. And the idea was you could kind of create one show that would capture a huge market of the American audience. And what you can see over time is that the ways that Americans watch television totally changed. So if you look, for example, nothing's really like I Love Lucy, but the final episode of MASH in 1986 had just about 42% of Americans. If you go a generation forward, final episodes of Friends and Seinfeld in 1998 and 2004 had about 18% of Americans, and then it just drops off a cliff. If you look at the biggest shows following that, things like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, you're talking about 3% of the American population. Even the Super Bowl, which people bragged last year was watched by more people than ever before. It's true, but it was a smaller market share of the American audience. So it's mostly because the market is growing international, but as a unifying force where everyone does something at the same time, even the Super Bowl, which had bucked the trend, is now kind of folding in. So there was this sense of like, well over 80% of American Jews in the 1950s and 60s affiliated with Jewish institutions. They would show up, they could be represented by the Reform movement, the conservative movement, the Greater San Diego Federation. People really thought of themselves in these large groups moving together, and that shifted to radical customization. And TV is just one example of that. The other thing that's gone on is that there's been a huge shift from joining to anti-affiliation. Millennials and Gen Zers don't want to show up and join. They want to do something that feels like perfectly customized for them. And there is a huge distrust. So if you look at baby boomers, for example, when asked, generally speaking, can you trust people? 42% of baby boomers responded yes, they agreed with that statement. But for millennials, it was only 18%. And again, I don't think it's that millennials are afraid that they're going to get mugged on the street. What they're talking about is they don't trust institutions to get them. Because what's also shifted is as there's been a decrease in one size fits all, there's also been an increase that in a kind of individualism where every individual feels very special and very unique. And the idea of a synagogue or a federation or a Hillel really getting you is a much more difficult thing. So they do trust people, they just don't trust institutions. These are also, if you think about Gen Z, these are people who've grown up with school shootings. They've grown up where they have a default belief that all of their data and personal stuff is being stolen by tech companies. Have seen a massive explosion of misinformation in the political climate. So there's a sense of, I'm going to, like those videos that keep showing up on TikTok, I'm going to believe them, but only because I know the person who posted it, not necessarily the person who created it. So there's a little bit of, there's a gap there. In other words, they're still trusting the system without always realizing they're trusting the system. And we know that that's one of the ways that misinformation is propagated. But for most Jewish organizations in North America, the operating system is still about, oh my gosh, Rosh Hashanah was better than it's ever been. We had standing room only at services. That is an entirely 20th century way of measuring success. It's entirely focused on macro community and counting numbers. And the whole idea of a high holiday service is how do you have one service that works for the largest number of people possible? And so it's a great example of how we're still measuring things in the kind of 20th century operating system when what we need is a 21st century operating system. Okay. Second thing that I want to suggest is that we need some new language. And again, if we were doing a full workshop and I had time here, I would say, what are the ways that people in the organized Jewish community talk about Jews? And, I've done this hundreds of times since the book came out in 2016. And the answers usually work out to things like involved, uninvolved, core, periphery, affiliated, unaffiliated. Occasionally you'll get Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, but usually what people mean by that is not the ideology of those three denominations, but like when someone says, well, I'm really Reformed, they're usually not saying, I believe in informed choice and I love the Reform movement. They're usually saying, I don't do a lot, right? And I was accused once of being Orthodox, and they weren't saying that I believe the Torah came from God. They're saying, like, you're super Jewish, right? And so I think actually Reform, Conservative, Orthodox in that kind of colloquial term means like super Jewish, middle Jewish, and less Jewish. But all of that language is very institutionally based. It's very linear. And it's like we over here are measuring them. Like we're the involved and they're the uninvolved. And there's a certain kind of emotional violence involved in us trying to get them to become like us, to become involved, to become affiliated. Even the way that Israel advocacy shows up, there's a lot of like, if young people only knew what we knew, they would see it our way. So we can kind of convert them into like our kind of Jew. And my experience on campus for really 17 years was that young people who don't fit into organized Jewish life, they increasingly are waking up feeling proud to be Jewish. They're increasingly waking up believing that Judaism has something valuable to offer them, but they are not interested in seeing Judaism as a club that they join, and they're not necessarily interested in showing up in our spaces. I'll tell you one quick story to make this come to life. There was a student who I call Samantha in the book. It's not her real name, but she got involved in something that we were doing on campus, and she actually was from Southern California, not Orange County per se, but from Los Angeles. And she didn't do any of the things that Jews do in North America. No bar bat mitzvah ceremony, didn't go to Seder growing up, didn't belong to a synagogue. And she started, it was amazing. She woke up every morning and put money in a tzedakah box as a way of cultivating a sense of appreciation in her life, that she not only had enough, but she had enough to give to others. She would do Havdalah privately on her own, so none of her sorority sisters would know, because she'd be a little embarrassed if she was outed doing these kind of Jewish rituals. And at some point she said, Rabbi Mike, I want to go to Limud New York, which is a great conference. I'm not ripping on Limud New York in any way. And I said, Sarah, I don't know if you're ready. That's a lot of Jews in one place. And she said, I'm ready. So we get there Friday, right before Shabbat starts. Saturday morning, I see Sarah, which is her real name, and she is bawling her eyes out. I said, Sarah, what's wrong? She's like, I don't understand anything that's going on in this place. And I said, is it the Hebrew? She said, no, everything's being translated. Is it clicky? No, people are being really warm and welcoming. I said, what is it that you don't get? And basically she didn't get Jewish geography and schmoozing and all of the cultural things that probably make most of us on this call feel at home. It made her feel like an alien. And she actually said it, she was a sophomore, it was a little bit judgmental, but she said, I thought being Jewish meant it was about a certain set of values and rituals and how to build a life of meaning. But if being Jewish means I need to become these people, I don't want to do it. And that was like, it struck a chord with me that it can't just be about affiliation and recruitment and making the next generation like our generation, but there needs to be something else. And our language needs to reflect this. So the language that we came up with, and there's a full slide that will define this in the ways that I'm doing verbally for you all, is that instead of saying involved and uninvolved and core and periphery, that you have what Richard Joel called empowerment Jews. I think Richard meant involved, but what we developed at Penn Hillel was the idea is that empowerment Jews spent more time with other Jews. They have more Jewish friends. They are more likely to live in a Jewish neighborhood. If they're lawyers, they're more likely to work at the traditionally Jewish firm in town. They seek out organized Jewish life because that's their main connection. And they've got lots of institutional languages. They're shopping for shuls. They'll say, oh, the rabbi was a little too touchy-feely. We're looking for more intellectual and more traditional egalitarian. An engagement Jew would just say, I didn't like the vibe. It was weird. And it's not because they're not smart or because they're not Jewish. It's that they don't speak in institutional nomenclature about their own Jewish experience because they see it as something private and internal, what Arnie Eisen called the sovereign self. But empowerment Jews, if you were moving somewhere to Chicago or San Diego or Philadelphia, empowerment Jews might show up at Federation or Hillel or Moishe House as a way of meeting other Jews. But here's really the key. Empowerment Jews have institutional resumes. So they know the lingo, they know the acronyms. They might say something like, oh my gosh, I just read an article in the JTA about what's going on with If Not Now or JVP, and it's really scary what's going to happen with the BDS movement. Engagement Jews, 55% of which have incredibly positive views about being Jewish and want to do more Jewish, wouldn't know what the JTA, JVP, or BDS movements were. They wouldn't know any of those acronyms because they didn't do camp, youth group, Hillel, all those kind of things. And I just want to, let's see how many people are on video. I'm going to ask you guys to raise your hands for a second. So raise your hand if you belong to a synagogue. Okay, so on my screen, that's 100%. It may not be 100% of everyone. Raise your hand if you have been to Israel before. Okay, almost 100%. I can't, Jasper's got ducks. I can't see if the ducks are raising hands. Okay, good, thank you. How many of you sent your kids to Jewish summer camp or went to Jewish summer camp? Raise your hands. Okay, good. So this is a great little litmus test, and what it proves is that we are all empowerment Jews. Because if you contrast that little mini spot survey with national data, so national data is that about 22% of American Jews belong to synagogues at any point in time, about 33% over the course of their lives. Only about a third of American Jews have been to Israel, and that number is inflated by birthright. So with older Jews, that number is much lower, and only 15% of American Jews go to Jewish summer camp, according to the Foundation for Jewish Camping. So you start to see that, like, we think we're doing all of this diverse stuff, but most of what the organized Jewish community does is planned by people like us with our resumes. And we think it's diverse because we're offering yoga and online learning and a traditional egalitarian service on Saturday morning. And it is diverse on that level, but it's not diverse in the sense that it's the same offerings come up with by the same people with the same marketing strategy. And basically my theory is, and the reason I made engagement Jews in a green bubble here is I think there's opportunity here. Most of these engagement Jews are not less Jewish than us. They just have a different identity matrix. Their identity is constructed in a different way where they feel like being Jewish is a private thing. It's about grandparents. Feelings about Israel are not something you show up at a rally about, but it's something, again, that you feel because you went on birthright and you have some connection to the people that you met or the experience that you had when you were there. And so these folks, there's a lot of energy, there's money, there's potential here, but what they don't want, just like Sarah, is they don't want to join our clubs. They're looking for Judaism, but they're not looking for Jewish clubs. And so my theory here is that empowerment Jews, if you were the leader of an empowerment organization, and you said to me, Mike, this is all great, but my mission is the 15%. And I'm actually pretty convinced if we do a better job, we can grow that to 25%. I would say to you, Zeigazant, go for it. That makes total sense. The only problem I have is when folks in the empowerment bubble are doing all of these programs and they think that they're going to magically reach engagement Jews. And I think it's the misconstruing of the strategy that is my beef, not choosing one side or the other, right? And the theory is that while there's all of this potential here, the only way to activate engagement Jews is through a relationship. And you know this to be true in your own life. My guess is about 1% of people will see something advertised and having no connection to the organization or the thing will show up randomly. Most of us, 99% of us, don't go to something unless we know the people, or you might go to a new yoga class, but that's because you already love yoga, right? But you have to have some kind of relationship. So what happens is empowerment organizations are investing a huge amount of energy thinking that they're marketing to empower engagement Jews, when in reality they're talking to themselves. And that's okay, right? You need a core. You need a deep sense of belonging if you want to create real community. I want an empowerment community because that's where I'm happiest as a Jew. But I just think, again, if you really want to activate this 85%, there needs to be a different delivery mechanism. This is true for prayer, for giving tzedakah, for connecting to Israel, for feeling part of Jewish peoplehood, for lighting Shabbat. Anything you can think of in the broadest definition of what's Jewish, I think fits into this theory. And again, it's not about picking what part of Judaism. It's about, is there a model where Jewish life could operate with a little bit more nuance, a little bit more of a 21st century operating system? Good? Okay. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to skip the next slide. I want to show you 4 different models of this. Well, I'll just do the slide quickly. It's important. The second major philosophical shift is, one is shifting the language, and the second is shifting the focus. One of the things that we found all over neuroscience and linguistic science is that you need language to be able to think, but the way that you speak changes the way you think, which changes the way you act. And most organizations spend most of their time thinking about what the institution needs. It's not I don't say that in a really detrimental way. If you're a board, you have fiduciary responsibility for that institution. But there's a lot of focus on membership and building and getting next generation to come and take over what we've built. And the irony of this is that simply by inverting the values pyramid, there's an opportunity to essentially change the topic sentence at a board meeting, at a planning meeting, to, instead of what do we need to do for the institution, we focus on how do we make a transformative impact on individuals to spark their Jewish lives. They will need to engage with communities in order to live out that Jewish life. And ultimately, there will be powerful, well-funded organizations, but it's a different theory of change that starts with the individual rather than the institution. And you should just try it at a family Seder or at a board meeting. If you just change the order of the sentences around in the topic, in the open paragraph, you'll see that actually the whole culture of how you envision your strategy changes when you start with a different sentence, even though we both know that both the institution and the individuals are important. So that's my second major philosophical shift, but this is how it gets into strategy. So almost everything that we do in the organized Jewish world functions. This is not fancy terms here, but I think they're useful. This is not in the book, by the way. These are things I learned after the book came out that I felt like would help drive the ideas home. But almost everything we do focuses on the receiving model. That here we are as leaders in the Jewish organization in the middle, and our job is to get people to come to us. And that's why we measure membership and how many people gave and how big the annual campaign was and how many freshmen came to the Hillel barbecue. All of that measurement is the receiving model. And there's a huge amount of literature out there about how to improve the experience of the receiving model. But what there's very little of in organized Jewish life is what I call the seeking model. In fact, when I ask people to name a model of the seeking, that runs on the seeking model, people often come up with things like Ikar in Los Angeles, Sharon Browse's Amazing Minion, or One Table, or all these other amazing organizations. But these are all still very, very much the receiving model, because anything that has a sign up that requires you to go to them in order to access Jewish life is something that's operating on the receiving model. The examples of a seeking model, there are Hillel's doing this. I actually feel like Hillel's probably moved away from it a little bit in the past few years. Chabad does this sometimes. Like in the Philadelphia area, Chabad will go to the King of Prussia Mall, one of the largest malls in the world, and will stand there and try to figure out who's Jewish during Hanukkah time and offer them something to connect them to Jewish life. That is a seeking model, and Federation fundraising is a seeking model, right? If it comes out in the local paper that you sold your company for $200 million, Federation will seek you out one-on-one, concierge, and create a customized track to get you connected to Jewish life. But almost everything else we do operates on the receiving model. And part of what I'm trying to do here is there's nothing wrong with the receiving model, but what would it look like if Jewish organizations could run both and could have like a little bit more facility with two different organizing principles? Okay, here's the second theory. This is It's circling one more time around, but like just a layer deeper. It's the same idea, but a layer deeper. This I call the Yom Kippur paradigm, and this is called the Seder paradigm. And the reason I did this is because people, however I was saying it, it made it sound like I didn't care about the legacy part of Jewish life. That I didn't care about having people show up, but I do. And I'm a rabbi, right? So I want there both to be Yom Kippur and Pesach in the calendar. I'm not arguing get rid of one of the holidays, but I am arguing that they have different functions in how they create community and the impact they have on Jews. So if we had time, I would ask you, what gets you into a Yom Kippur service? And the answer is some form of an institutional relationship. You're a member, you have a ticket, you heard the rabbi is great, the cantor is great, the building is near where you live, people like you belong there, right? And then people at the very front of this room who have titles like rabbi, cantor, head of the ritual committee, make decisions about the service. And the people up front with titles try to figure out kind of a one size fits all, not too much Hebrew, not too little Hebrew, get it right down the middle, so that the largest number of people are happy and engaged. And there's power in this. Standing together with thousands and thousands of people on Yom Kippur, reciting same words that your parents and grandparents recited, there's power. But it's interesting, I've never heard anyone say to me that the source of their Jewish identity, the thing that turned them on, was Yom Kippur services. It's something that they would call, like in technology speak, a sustaining technology. If you have the Jewish bug, so to speak, it can sustain you, right? Because you see all those people in the community, you hear the melodies, you get reconnected with the ideas. Seder, by contrast, what gets you into a Seder? It is entirely about a relationship. Someone invites you. It's not through a ticket or a website or a geographic area. There's someone who says, hey, will you come over for Seder? Will you bring something? We're all Googling stuff, so we can have a great discussion at Seder this year. Seder is infinitely customizable. The gap between leaders and participants is shrunk. You're all at the same table together. And there's no conservative version or reform version or Orthodox version. Every Seder can be customized based on who's leading it and who's there. And what is interesting is people will say that things like Shabbat dinner or Seder were the thing that turned them onto Judaism, because it may not be a sustaining technology to be in a small group like this, but there's a potential to create relationships and learning that creates a sea change for people. So it's a disruptive technology in the Seder paradigm. But again, same thing, 99% of what we do programmatically in the organized Jewish world functions on the Yom Kippur paradigm. And this other paradigm, which is like baked into the calendar, we know that you can do small little micro community events and still feel like you're part of the larger Jewish people. We just don't do a lot of it, right? It is an atrophied skill in terms of community organizing. Good? Okay, I'm gonna do one more piece of theory, and then I'm gonna pause and we're gonna get into the Q&A. Third rule of how you reach millennials and people in this engagement bucket is to make it relational. And Ron Wolfson is a mentor of mine. He coined this term relational Judaism. I wouldn't have a book without Ron. And I feel like after reading Ron's book, it's not always 100% clear what he means. I try to make it really concrete. But relational Judaism means that you're using relationships to connect people, not institutions. So for example, and you can have one program run two different ways. One is an institutional way and one is a relational way. And I'll give you an example. Has anyone ever heard of this program, Guess Who's Coming to Shabbat? Or they'll have Shabbat across Chicago or Shabbat across Philly, where everybody in the synagogue or in the day school community, you can sign up to either host or be hosted for Shabbat dinner, and then they do these things all around the neighborhood. Have people heard this before? It's a very popular program. So if let's use a day school as an example. If a Jewish day school says, sign up if you're interested in hosting or being hosted for Guess Who's Coming to Shabbat, that is an institutional way of doing the program. And sometimes what happens is the institution will get hosts and they will go through their lists of parents or alumni and assign 10 people to go to Ari Katz's house for Shabbos dinner. That is entirely using the institution to try to create community. And it works, but only in one way. What those kind of guests who coming to Shabbat programs can do is they can break down the silos within the empowerment bucket of Jews, within the regulars. And it's really important, and we should do it 4 times a year in every Jewish organization in the world. Whether it's a synagogue, a Hillel, a day school, a JC, it doesn't matter. But what it doesn't do is get you into that green bubble for engagement Jews. And it's not really going to play well for millennial or Gen Z Jews. The way you can take that exact same program and make it relational is, instead of saying, let us know if you want to host, in this situation, the organization goes and recruits 50 or 70 people to host through relationships, right? Not through a mass email. And then instead of pairing those hosts with other people that signed up, you ask those hosts to make a relationship map. Who do you know? Who's in your neighborhood? Who do you know through the swim club? Who do you know through your kids' activities? Who's Jewish, who might not have been at a Shabbat dinner in the past 12 months? And why don't you invite that person, not the obvious person who has access to all of this good Jewish life that's existing? And what you can end up doing is really running these things side by side, and you kind of double what you're trying to do. If you were a Jewish community, for example, that was able to get a huge celebrity to come for the gala, like a Gal Gadot kind of celebrity. So it is true, you might have a record-breaking number of attendees show up, but what most Jewish organizations would do is spend all of their time and money on planning that program and recruiting people for that one-off event without thinking about how do you design that 10,000 person gathering to actually generate new relationships and to follow through on that, to use it as a jumping off point. Okay, last piece, and then we'll turn it over for Q&A, is Clayton Christensen, Zichrono Livracha, not a Jewish man, but a Harvard Business School professor, wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, where he basically says, why is it that legacy organizations often seem to be unseated by startups? And why is it that big legacy organizations are bad at innovation? And he kind of names something that we all know, but he does it in a very profound way, which is the things you need to be a big, mature, high quality organization to be Microsoft, right? It means that you got to go slow, and you got to have really good management structures, and you got to have a bulletproof product, and everybody needs Microsoft, and everyone's using Excel, and no one's excited about it. It's very unsexy, but that is the exact opposite set of criteria that you need to be an innovator, which is you got to move quick, you got to be willing to blow things up, you got to be willing to fail. And so there are different corporate cultures and different structures and all sorts of different things. And what he basically said is there's only 2 ways for a legacy organization to really innovate. One is to buy innovation, which you see all over the tech sector now. You know, Google buys Waze, Facebook buys Instagram, Microsoft is buying all sorts of innovation all the time, even ChatGPT, right? Bought it and brought it in-house to develop it. But the other model is, if you want to do it in-house, the only model he comes up with is the example of Dayton Hudson starting Target. And Dayton Hudson was kind of a slow, old school department store. They started Target in Minneapolis, and they were like, do whatever you want. Build your own culture, hire your own people, build your own corporate metrics. You can even open up a Target across the street from us and try to put us out of business. And that is the model that Clayton Christensen shows as the right way to build innovation. And so this is actually what we stumbled into this at Penn Hillel before we knew any of the theory. But we had Penn Hillel that was reaching about 45% of the Jewish students. And then we created something called the Jewish Renaissance Project. And it was very much like a startup, new staff, new brand. People knew that JRP was Hillel, but it was Hillel for people who would never go to Hillel. They knew that. And we just figured it out as we went. But in the end, what we ended up doing was doubling the number of Jews that we were reaching. We reached about 45% through Hillel and another 45% through JRP. And JRP was all relationship-based. Hillel was program-based. It was like, one was a Yom Kippur paradigm, one was the Seder paradigm, and we ran them together. And I'll just give you one last example of this to try to bring it home. But on a normal Friday night, Hillel might have 400 or 500 people having Shabbat dinner in Hillel. It was a little bit generic, a little bit corporate. It was a big kosher cafeteria. It ran its own way. And if you were a newcomer, it was very hard to break in. But on that same Friday night, we might have 400 or 500 students having Shabbat dinner in fraternity houses, in dorms, in the student newspaper office. All of those meals, there was no boundary to entry because people invited their friends. And so there was a way of doubling the number of Jews on a Friday night having Shabbos dinner, or studying Jewish text, or giving tzedakah, or having a seder. But one that was really well designed for like empowerment Jews, and one was really well designed for engagement Jews. And I think there's something here that we can do as people who care about the Jewish future, that to actually create different landing pads for people, and that it's not trying to get everyone to go to NBC to watch I Love Lucy, right? There could be dozens of streaming services, and even if a hit show on Hulu only gets 3 million people, they're still going to make their money. And there's always a way to monetize these new technologies. The music business did this when CDs were kind of put out of business. They figured out how to make money with MP3s and streaming services. And the Jewish community can figure out a way to sustain itself. It doesn't only have to be through membership or fee for service. There are other models that we can explore. So again, I think this is true when it comes to Shabbat. It is also true when it comes to breaking down the perspective that all Jews in the organized Jewish community have the same political views and the same views on Israel, and the same, everyone's a doctor and a lawyer. And there's a lot of reasons why people feel like they don't fit in. And there's just a limit to how many people you can bring into the macro and have it fit. And so part of the idea is just you balance it out. If your community in earnest is 96% white, it is going to be very hard to make those 4% Jews of color feel deeply welcomed in macro community just because of the demographics. And so we just need another tool. And that's just one example of the way that we can be more inclusive politically, to deal with some of the Israel stuff, to deal with some of the generational stuff. There's a tool here by using relationships and by using two different operating systems. Okay, I'm going to wrap there. Ari, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks for setting the stage for this discussion. Please feel free to chat questions. So let's start. How prepared were the Jewish institutions, the established legacy institutions, for this change in the world? And I refer to the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, for example. It seems like everyone was taken by surprise. So was Federation ready for the new model, or was it a sudden change?
Yeah, so this has not been a sudden change. Bowling Alone is like one of the core sources for the book, and a ton of research that grew out of and reacting to Bowling Alone. But the idea, the punchline, I don't know if anyone's read the whole book. I certainly did not read the whole book. It's long. But the punchline is people still bowl in 1990s or whenever he wrote it, the early aughts. But instead of joining a league, they bowl alone. And when my mom joined our synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio, she joined in order to meet other young couples. And when I joined a synagogue in the Philadelphia suburbs, we, with a bunch of our friends who all had little kids, joined a synagogue together with our clique already in existence, right? And so it's not like it was new or sudden. These trends have been growing. You can see even, that TV example of like 70% to 40% to 18%, to 6% to 3%. Those same trends you can see in Jewish affiliation from the 1960s onwards, right? That what was in the 1960s, again, 80-90% affiliation is down, to 22%. But the answer, every time the Jewish community got a new demographic study about young people not joining, not showing up, they kind of, like, the analogy I sometimes use is Blockbuster Video. Did everyone remember Blockbuster? So it's like, imagine we're living in a world where people are starting to do Netflix, where people are starting to stream video on their devices, and they're not even using TVs, but they're just holding their iPhones and watching. And Blockbuster's losing their market share. They were dominant. And they're like, well, what if we had free popcorn? And what if we get rid of the rewind fees for VHS cassettes? And that's often what the organized Jewish community is doing when they're trying to innovate, is that they're putting this very shallow window dressing. But again, it's like everybody in the room, and I've been to synagogues all over the country where they're like, no, we're really diverse, Rabbi. We've got young leaders in their 50s and old leaders in their 70s, right? I love federation in synagogues, but young is not 50 in today's world, right? And again, it's what happens is if you're trying to innovate, so what a lot of synagogues did is, well, we used to just have one service on Saturday morning, but now we've got a nature walk and a yoga minyan and a touch Shabbat. And basically what they did is they took the same market share and they divided it. So every one of those services, if we're talking 500 people on Saturday morning, we wish, but if there were 500 people, so now you've got 100 going to yoga and 100 going to services and 100 going on a nature walk. And then there's this other little thing going on, which is it's not good yoga. It's like Jewish yoga, right? It's like shul yoga. And so one of the things that's counterintuitive is if you want to reach new people, all of the research shows that instead of lowering the bar and the content, because if you're an engagement Jew, you're never going to go to the shul yoga, right? You're going to go to like the yoga studio where there's a real yoga person, right? Not like the ed director who happens to do yoga in their spare time. And ironically, what the research shows is if someone on the engagement side is going to take a risk and show up, that they want it to be intimate, they want it to have serious content, and like they don't need barbecues or baseball or men's club. They actually want something really serious and challenging. As serious and challenging as a yoga class would be, right? But the Jewish version of it. So I don't think they were particularly ready for it, and I still don't think they're ready for it, Ari. And one of the challenges that we see, for example, is Federation fundraising has continued to tick up since 2010 when I started working on these ideas, but the number of givers has gone down. So it's bigger gifts from a fewer number of people. After October 7th, there was something called the surge, where there's this huge influx of people who wanted to be involved. But the reality is that these are people who are already affiliated. These are people who paid for the shul membership, but never came, and now they're showing up. And one of the terrible things that's happening is these people show up, and then they see, oh, I don't know anybody, or I don't feel included, or nobody said hi to me, or I asked if this seat was taken at Kiddush, and someone looked over their shoulder and said yes, and went back to talking to their friends. And so now they don't want to come back again, because what we've tried to do over and over again is dress up the same product in a new skin and hope it's going to magically fix this. And the rule here is that you actually need, I didn't show you these diagrams so deeply, but there's a theory called asset-based community development theory. It was actually the core of the book, and there's a whole chapter on it. But one of these are guys at Northwestern University, John McKnight and John Kretzman, and they're studying inner city community development. And so they'd see, for example, Chicago pour millions of dollars into trying to solve homelessness or drug use, and they'd look 10 years out, and it's worse. Drug use has gone up, homelessness has gone up. And what they found is that when you're trying to keep the institution strong, as opposed to make an impact on people, then the answer to every problem is a new program. And what you end up inadvertently training the community to do is to become passive consumers of literacy programs or drug prevention programs or Jewish life. And what I'm arguing in this relational model and this two operating system model is one model needs to say not what can we do for you, but how can a Jewish organization see its mission as pushing Jews to do for themselves, unlocking the power of social networks to do for themselves. No institution could coordinate all of the seders happening on a given Pesach night. That's the point, is that when institutions want to hold on to everything, it really limits their ability to change. I want to say one last thing, Ari, and then I'll turn it back to you for another question, but there's a famous Hasidic teaching that says, even one gold coin held up in front of your eyes can block out an entire mountain. And the Hasidic masters taught, it's given in lots of different rabbis' names, but I don't know where it really originates from. What they're saying is greed. I'm not saying greed. But what I'm saying is we built this huge infrastructure in the North American Jewish community, and keeping the lights on, keeping the building full, keeping membership up is that gold coin for us. And it's no one's mission statement says, our mission is to inspire the next generation of people to join Beth Am, right? It's always about Judaism, and yet the work that most of these organizations spend their time doing is trying to keep affiliation higher. Actually, I want to say one last thing, I'm sorry. Kodak is a perfect example of this. Kodak invents digital photography, but it's not real photography, right? Because real photography is like the professionals and the hobbyists, and digital is all pixelated, if you remember in the early days, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it. And ultimately, it's the thing that consumes Kodak. And that's actually, I think, the same mistake that Jewish organizations are still making today, is that we keep trying to figure out how are we going to sell the young people film and paper and cameras, when what the young people want is instantaneous pictures that they don't have to go to the photomat. And if Kodak had remembered that their real business was the memory business, was preserving Kodak moments, they could have figured out how to harness the power of digital, but they got confused and thought their business was selling more paper, chemicals, and film. And in some ways, every federation, every Hillel, every youth group, every synagogue that thinks their job is to get Jews to show up in bricks and mortar, to partake of an official program, and that's the mission, that's the equivalent of trying to sell people paper and chemicals and film when everyone's taking pictures with their phones.
Thank you. There were some notes of people, given you're talking to the empowerment Jews, as you mentioned, right? So people had noted one thing that they're sad about is their legacy institutions, some of them are now gone and they feel like uprooted. So I know we're talking about millennials, but there's also, and then maybe it's a different discussion, there's this uprootedness now that's for the empowerment Jews who look around and say, where did this institution go? It's gone. I used to belong, I used to be involved, and now it's gone, or it's very weak. We'll get there in a second. The other point is, I don't think your analysis of synagogues is fair, because since I do belong to a synagogue, my wife is a chazan, and I get to see behind the veil, and I've been very involved and even have a side minyan. The challenge with synagogues is not to bring new people in, it's to actually get the people that are in to come in.
Yeah.
And so the synagogues can't do all the stuff that you mentioned, because if they did that, then they wouldn't be able to do what they have to do, which is to really get the people who want to be at the synagogue or involved to get more active, because such a large percentage do not show up on a regular basis other than Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So they have no ability to do what you want them to do. They really don't. I mean, they can one idea that you had recommended, I think, would be like the rabbi would have office hours in the Starbucks and just sit there, and people can come and see the rabbi there, whoever. I mean, it doesn't matter who it is, right? But the synagogues can't do what you want them to do, because they would go, they can't, their problem is they can't function with their own people.
Right. So it's interesting. So again, this is maybe where I definitely agree with you, Ari, that I'm not being fair, but that's part of the play of being the provocateur. I am creating like an overly wooden straw man of what a synagogue or a federation is. And there's a lot of amazing work going on for real. That's not a throwaway line. So I am being a little bit unfair for the attempt to kind of push, but I disagree about the idea that synagogues can't do it, because the fantasy that I'm trying to put, and this is what people said about Hillel, are you crazy? We have this 36,000 square foot beautiful building. You're going to put us out of business. But the reality is that simply by focusing on impact over institution, the irony is, by pretending we didn't care about Hillel, we doubled the number of students who were engaged in Jewish life through Hillel. That increased our ability to raise money. We could go to donors who hated Hillel, who said, I didn't go to Penn Hillel when I was a student, my kids didn't go to Hillel. And then when we tell them about what we call JRP, they'd say, wow, if that had been there, I would, and then they invest. And the irony is, there are lots of people in every community in North America who are pissed off at synagogues, and you can't sell them on synagogue. But if you showed up and were able to play synagogue and anti-synagogue, you might be able to get them to create the CATS leadership program that was going to bring Jewish life to people. And the idea here is, and I think every synagogue could do it, and I'll give you some concrete examples. If you're up to date on governance best practices, synagogues have huge boards. Those board job descriptions, I hope everyone's board has one. But so there's a minimum gift, attendance at a certain number of meetings, maybe some committee work, Maybe you have to come and work as a greeter some Shabbases. But one of the simple ways to make the synagogue more relational is to say, and to host one Jewish event a month in your home for members who don't show up, to get to know 10 or 15 people who live in and we have all the zip codes and all the addresses, so we can map it out. And there's a way to do this in Google Maps. You throw your directory in Google Maps and it will show you where your board lives and where other members live. And the idea is that we're going to develop a strategic plan to grow the number of people who come on Friday night and to quadruple the number of Shabbat meals that an average Jew gets invited to in a normal year. That's a way to do it in a synagogue. A synagogue, the rabbi, it's not the rabbi goes to Starbucks and you can pop in because that's receiving, but it's actually that part of some staff members' time is going through the directory and saying, hey, Ari, I don't think we've had a chance to meet. Can I take you for coffee? Can we grab a beer? Can we go play tennis? Whatever it is that you do, and you get to know them. And the theory is that there's a formulation for what a great, coffee date looks like in the situation. But you're not asking, what could the synagogue do for you? Rather, it's much more around, the vibe is like, what pisses you off and inspires you about Jewish life? And when you get to kind of the pain about how I wanted it to be, I just put the document in the chat so everyone can see the slides and download a copy if they'd like. But there's a lot of pain that Jews feel about Judaism not working for them in the way that they wanted, about Shabbat dinner with the family not being the way they envisioned. And we would see this over and over again, Ari. I would go out to coffee with students on campus and say, Rabbi Mike, I'm happy to have coffee with you, but I don't like Hillel. I went once, I hated it. There were too many traditional kids, they scared the hell out of me. And then I was like cool back then and young, neither of which I am anymore. But I would say, I don't give an F if you ever come to Hillel, right? And I would say, I would get them talking about that mix of guilt and pride that they feel. And very quickly, they would say, I'm not interested in Hillel, but if you're saying, and then I would say to them, the next step is first you investigate that story, you get them telling their Jewish story. The second step is what we call, it's investigation, validation, provocation. The validation is not, it's okay to feel that way. The validation is oh my God, I've talked to 30 other sophomores in the Greek system who all feel the same way you do. How can it be that we live in Orange County and none of us are getting what we think? Someone just messaged me privately that I'm still cool. Thank you so much. I'll tell my wife. She may not agree with you, but or my 15-year-old daughter. She really won't agree with you. But the idea that there are other people who are stuck in the same limbo of I don't want to go and join and I don't want to do nothing. And then it's the provocation is, what are we going to do about this? It can't be that in a place as amazing as Orange County or, pick your city, that our choices are show up and feel like an outsider or not show up. And so that moment of provocation, and it's very different from a focus group, and it's not asking, what can the shul do for you? But, and then, what I found over time is that it drives more resources. And so
right.
We ended up having more money for Hillel's legacy projects because of our engagement efforts and our startup than we ever would have if we had just been running Hillel.
Since you want to talk about Hillel, there were many notes saying Hillel versus Chabad. And
Yeah.
It seems to many people that Chabad has been much more successful than Hillel, and that their model is the exact model almost that you put together. They're the anti-Hillel, they're the anti-establishment, they're the startup, they're the rabbi who calls you, who interacts with you, who hosts the Friday night, who gives the kids drinks. And I guess the question is, what's your thought on that? And then here's the thing. Ultimately, if Chabad wins, what does that mean to these millennials and their worldview? Because we really haven't spoken about the fact that what do we do with these millennials? Do they really, are they really not going to show up? What's the percentage of the ones who do show up versus the ones who you have to go and reach? What happens if they don't show up? And what happens if someone like Chabad wins on the Hillel campus?
Yeah. So I think Chabad has been amazing. I've been a lover of Chabad since the beginning. I had great relationships with Chabad at Penn. I don't think that they're doing better than Hillel. Honestly, depends on the campus. There are some campuses where the 800-pound gorilla is Chabad and some campuses where it's Hillel. But if you What I actually think is going on is that the startup has a halo effect. That you could go to Hillel and it's a beautiful building and there's hundreds of people, but the food isn't perfect. You know, the chicken's dried out and it's like the whole thing was terrible. You go to Chabad, it could be a dilapidated old building and the food's kind of disgusting, but because it's new and because it's hosted by a human, it feels Hamish. And there's a different set of metrics of how the startup is judged always, by the way, versus, you know, people are much more critical of their cab drivers than they are of their Uber drivers by and large, because the Uber driver becomes a human being. The cab driver is behind the glass, so to speak. But I think you're right that this, what I'm telling you is deeply inspired by Chabad and other organizations. My first year in Hillel, I watched as we were so busy planning programs, we had no ability to do the deep stuff, right? And I actually thought this is a crazy thing that the Hillel is so successful at Penn that we have no time to talk about God or about family or about how much money we need to be happy in our lives. That's crazy because all we're doing is talking about who's getting the food and who's making the flyer and who's doing the Facebook invite. And so part of what you can boil it down and make it as simple as I'm saying, like, I think the Jewish world would be, there would be a brighter future if federations and Hillels and JCCs adopted some of the best things about Chabad. Instead of legacy organizations being jealous that Chabad is quote unquote stealing their people, which you hear a lot about. So like, let's learn from them, right? And that's, you know, disruptive innovation, those innovators, eventually it's not so innovative, right? Like the innovation of the iPhone, which was incredibly disruptive, it's not that different to get a Samsung phone these days, right? Because Samsung took the best parts of iPhone and did their own version of it, right? And so I think I'm okay if you want to say all Mike is doing is advocating taking some Chabad DNA and bringing it. The nice thing about bringing it into the other worlds, I'm a pluralist. And as much as I love Chabad, Chabad doesn't allow for pluralistic Judaism. So they might be warm and welcoming, but you're not going to be able to say Kiddush as a woman. You're not going to be able to count in a minyan. You're not going to be able to be patrilineally Jewish or to be openly gay and be a leader in a Chabad community. You can in a pluralistic Jewish environment. But that's why Chabad's beautiful, because it's bringing a piece of the pie that we need.
But it just seems that they're doing all the pieces that you outlined. So let's finish really on the ramifications. So you have millennials. They are, in general, according to you, they're not empowered Jews. And so what's the ramification, and not just millennials, Gen Z, and what we're seeing in the news when it comes to Israel? You know, what is the ramification of them not being part of the empowered Jewish community? And what's the future with that, given all the stuff you're talking about that you are innovating, but is not really going on in general in our communities?
Yeah, so there was a story many years ago during maybe 2009 or 2014 during one of the Gaza wars, where our board got very worried about what are young, uninvolved Jews going to hear about Israel. And they're going to grow up knowing only that Israel is bombing Gaza. So we ran a bunch of meetings with all the JRP interns and hundreds of students. And interestingly enough, I remember one of them in particular. They're like, it was a bunch of fraternity guys, but they're like, F yeah, man. I love Israel. Like, go IDF. I hope they bomb Gaza. It was all of the angst was actually on the empowerment side, because you have to know a lot about Israel to be critical enough to like push for JVP or J Street or things like that. Mainstream American Jews tend to be very, very, very classically pro-Israel. And these kids were riffing about how rah-rah Israel they were. And I said, so what would you say if I told you there was a March for Gaza happening on the College Green? And they're like, F that, that's BS, man. And I said, great, so will you come out for the pro-Israel rally? And they're like, no way. And I said, why? They're like, it's not a football game. I'm not picking a team. I don't want to show up at some rally where they know every Knesset member and every war, and I'm made out to be like a fraud where I don't know enough about Israel. For them, their connection to Israel was about memories and family and that sovereign self. And so I think part of what this is going to mean for the future is, first of all, the Jews that we hear about being the most anti-Zionist tend to be Jews with significant Jewish community experience, or they're just hardcore progressives who are globbing on. But I'm telling you honestly, the people who are attacking the organized Jewish community, but 80% of them, 90% of them are empowerment Jews who feel like they didn't get an honest pass when they were kids in Hebrew school or day school or Young Judea or whatever they were doing. And if we really want to reach out to this engagement bubble, and I do think millennials and Gen Zs, you're going to see increasing disaffiliation in the organized Jewish community, unless there's the one counter is that rising anti-Semitism will change this equation. Okay. But I think the idea is that we need new language where we're not, again, not treating Israel, support of Israel, relationship with Israel as if it's a macro community event, as if you have to show up at a rally, as if you have to sign a pledge. The way to do this again is relational, and you kindle people's experience. I used to teach this class, do I believe in God is a silly question. Because Jews don't ask, what do you believe? Jews are historical people. We tell stories. The real question we should ask is, what have you experienced that feels like God? And that's the same thing. Instead of starting where we are, which is we need to support Israel, will you join us? That's an affiliation model. I think there's a way to use these relationships and to create Seder style engagements where you ask people, what do you feel about Israel? What have you experienced? What Israelis do you know? And there's ways to feed, again, then the Jewish organization's job is not to give the content, but is to push social networks to be able to do it for themselves in a Seder model. And it can be a sea change for deepening people's connection to Israelis, to Jews, to Jewish peoplehood, which is a precursor for being connected to Israel. I just don't think we can do it through the usual programming, which is like fighting BDS, signing petitions, coming to speakers. And so what it means is in the same way we need 2 operating systems for Shabbat, 2 operating systems for Jewish learning, we probably need 2 operating systems for engaging people in Israel. One of the other ideas I throw out in the book, it's a little bit underdeveloped, but this is an idea of multiple Jewish intelligences. And one of them, for example, is public versus private. One is ethnic versus universal, right? These are spectrums you could map yourself on. And almost all of the Israel programming we do is highly public and highly ethnocentric. And if you're a Jew who's more turned on privately, like you light Shabbat candles and you bless your children on Friday night, but you never go to shul, which there's a lot of those out there. And if your main orientation is towards universal values as opposed to ethnocentric values, we need a different way to connect people to Israel than public and particularistic in that way. And so I think the same kind of critique plays for Israel. Again, I'm not advocating move away from Israel or change it. I think the delivery system is what needs the innovation.
Well, we're out of time. This conference can continue for many hours, but some of us have to go back to work. So I want to thank you for your time, for sharing your vision, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. It is Sukkot, which means to me it's like 8 opportunities to have seders. And so there's an example of inviting different people to your sukkah, having the conversations in your sukkah, and I agree with you about institutions, but I think institutions are very important to the backbone of Judaism, but we do have to have the counter institution, the counter opportunities as well. But a sukkah is a great place to meet, right? And so I wish you all a Chag Sameach, happy Sukkot. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but maybe we'll have Rabbi Mike back and we can grill him with lots of questions. So
Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you for having me. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody.